She was the first woman to wear the army doctor's uniform in war. Her battles were fought with scalpels, sutures, and impossible choices. But the story she left behind was far greater than the medal she never wore. Alright, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The rain had settled in for the afternoon, falling in that soft, steady way that made the whole house feel like it was breathing slowly. On the floor, cross-legged on the rug and wrapped in one of her mother's old cardigans, sat Ava, 14, full of questions, with the kind of curiosity that didn't just peek under rocks, but wanted to know why the rock was there in the first place. She had a spiral-bound notebook in her lap and a pencil tapping lightly against her cheek. Every few seconds, she looked up at the old woman in the recliner. "Grandma," she said finally, "can I ask you something kind of personal?" Across the room, the grandmother, retired Colonel Dr. Eleanor Hayes, tilted her head. She set her tea down slowly, carefully, like she already sensed where this was headed. "I suppose that depends on the question," she said. Ava tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and sat up straighter. "For history class, we're supposed to do a project on someone who made a difference but never got enough credit." She hesitated, then added, "I want to do mine on you." The old woman didn't respond right away. She just looked at her granddaughter, really looked. At the same wide-set eyes she'd seen in her daughter. The same stubborn chin, the same spark of defiance that, once upon a time, had lived in a 16-year-old girl standing beside her fever-stricken brother's hospital bed, thinking, "This will never happen again if I can help it." "You sure?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft but steady. "It's not all shiny medals and salutes. There are things in my story you might not expect. Things I've never even told your mother." Ava's eyes lit with both fear and fascination. "I want to know the truth. Not the internet version. Yours." That did something. The old woman leaned forward slowly, her joints protesting with quiet cracks. She motioned toward the hallway. "In the closet, behind the green duffel bag, there's a box. Go on, bring it here." Ava sprang to her feet, disappearing into the hall. The sound of shuffling, then a muffled "got it," echoed down the corridor. When she returned, the shoebox looked almost too heavy for her arms. It was nothing remarkable, faded cardboard, a piece of masking tape peeling off one corner. But Eleanor's hands trembled slightly when she reached for it. She set the box gently on the rug between them, as if it were something alive. Ava leaned in, wide-eyed, as Eleanor peeled the lid off. Inside, photos, creased documents, field tags, folded letters. On top, a black and white snapshot of a young woman in dusty fatigues standing in front of a military transport plane, hair pinned back, helmet under one arm. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between nervous and unbreakable. "That's you," Ava said, almost whispering. "Right?" Eleanor nodded. "That photo was taken the day I landed in Kuwait. First deployment. First woman in my unit. Maybe the whole damn base." She gave a dry chuckle. Wasn't exactly a warm welcome. Ava turned the photo over. In faded ink, the words, "Kuwait, 1991. "You look scared," she said. "I was," Eleanor replied. "Not of war. Of being invisible." Ava was quiet now, the way children get when they sense something sacred is being unwrapped. Eleanor reached deeper into the box, pulled out a worn folder with a faded army seal on it. She held it in her lap for a long moment. "You know," she said, voice low, "people think the story starts when the uniform goes on. But mine didn't. Mine started long before that. In a hospital room. With a promise I whispered to a boy too sick to understand it." She looked at Ava. "If I tell you everything, you have to promise me one thing." Ava leaned forward. "Anything." don't just listen to what happened. Listen to why it happened. That's the part that matters. Ava nodded, eyes locked on her grandmother's. And so, Eleanor Hayes, once dismissed, once decorated, once broken and mended 100 different ways, began to tell her story. It started the summer I turned 16, she said, voice shifting. Your great-uncle had come down with a fever no one could explain. The summer Eleanor turned 16 was the hottest on record in their small Kansas town. Cornfields turned brittle. Rivers thinned to puddles. And in the middle of that relentless heat, her brother Luke collapsed on the kitchen floor one July afternoon, his face ghost pale, his skin burning. Her mother screamed. Her father lifted him into the truck, cursing under his breath the whole ride to the county hospital. Eleanor sat in the back, her hands pressed tight against her knees, watching her little brother's chest rise and fall like it might stop at any moment. They told them it was meningitis. Severe. Aggressive. And by the time they'd caught it, he'd already started convulsing. Eleanor spent 4 nights sleeping in a plastic chair beside his bed. She memorized the beeping of the heart monitor, the hiss of the 4. The nurses changed shifts, the doctors came and went, but she never moved. On the 5th night, when everyone else had gone home to shower or cry or scream into pillows, Eleanor held her brother's hand and whispered a promise. If you wake up, I swear I'll learn how to fix people. I'll never let this happen to anyone else. He didn't answer. But 2 days later, his eyes fluttered open. And Eleanor meant every word. She started spending afternoons at the hospital, watching the nurses work, scribbling notes in a tiny spiral notebook. She read her biology textbook before school even started. By the end of the semester, she knew how to pronounce words most adults stumbled over: cerebrospinal fluid, septicemia, bradycardia. Most people thought it was a phase. A way to cope. But Eleanor wasn't interested in distractions. She wanted knowledge. She wanted power. And not the kind boys in her town bragged about. She wanted the kind that could stop a mother's hands from trembling when the doctor gave a diagnosis. The kind that could put breath back into a body that had forgotten how to breathe. But college? Medical school? That kind of future wasn't just hard, it was nearly impossible. Her father worked at the grain mill. Her mother cleaned houses. There was no college fund, just canned peaches and coupons. Still, she applied. Secretly. She mailed the applications from the next town over so no one at the post office would tell. And when the envelope came, fat, heavy, real, she sat on the porch alone, reading the words that would change her life. We are pleased to inform you of your acceptance to the University of Kansas School of Medicine. She ran all the way to the mill, still in her bare feet, screaming for her father. But the celebration was short-lived. That same week, the Army sent a recruiting officer to the school for a seminar. Tuition was skyrocketing. The military was offering full scholarships to those who enlisted in their medical corps. Full ride, guaranteed job, officer training, the recruiter had said, his eyes gleaming. All you have to do is serve your country after you graduate. Eleanor wasn't thinking about politics or war zones. She was thinking about her brother. About her family. About what it would mean to put on that uniform and walk into a world that had never expected someone like her to show up. She signed the paperwork in pencil, then ink. Back in the living room, Ava's eyes widened. Wait, you joined the Army before med school? Eleanor nodded slowly. The Army was the only way I could afford to become a doctor. But I didn't know then how much it would cost me. She leaned back in the recliner, a small smile on her lips. The kind that only comes from remembering something painful you survived. They said I was brave. But the truth is, I was just too stubborn to back down. She tapped the folder again and whispered, more to herself than to Ava. That uniform didn't make me a soldier. But what came next? That's where the war really started. The barracks smelled like bleach and sweat. Eleanor stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching 24 cadets march in perfect, mechanical unison. Her boots were still too stiff, her collar too tight, and the stitched name tag on her uniform felt like a dare. She was the only woman in her cohort. Her arrival had been met with a spectrum of reactions: curiosity, discomfort, quiet resentment. No one said it outright, but she felt it in the stares. What's she doing here? During the first week, no one sat beside her in the mess hall. The second week, one of the instructors, a grizzled field medic named Sergeant Knox, called her Doc Barbie during a wound-packing drill. The men laughed. She didn't. She learned fast. Not just the medicine, but the politics. The silences. The sideways glances. The hierarchy of masculinity. Still, she showed up earlier than anyone else. Stayed later. Memorized every protocol. Practiced intubation on dummies until her fingers were numb. Some days she cried in the supply closet. But only after everyone else had gone. And slowly, something shifted. The jokes became fewer. A couple of the men began asking her questions. She earned respect, not because she demanded it, but because she left them no choice. Then came Major Rickman. He wasn't like the others. He was sharp-eyed, soft-spoken, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd seen too much to be impressed by bravado. He started leaving notes on her evaluations: exceptional field awareness, natural triage instincts, lead material. Once, he pulled her aside after a live trauma simulation. "You've got the thing," he said. "The grit. Most don't." For the first time since she'd arrived, Eleanor felt something she hadn't dared to feel: hope. Maybe she could do this. Maybe she'd earned her place. Back in the present, Ava was scribbling furiously in her notebook, eyebrows furrowed. "Did anyone else ever back you up?" she asked. Eleanor hesitated. "Some." Quietly. But Rickman was the first to say it out loud. Ava smiled. "Sounds like he was one of the good ones." Eleanor didn't answer right away. By week 10, the deployment roster was released. Most cadets would go to domestic bases for supervised field work. A select few, those deemed combat-ready, would be sent to overseas hospitals. Eleanor's name was on the overseas list. Her hand shook when she saw it. Deployment meant pressure. Chaos. Real wounds. Real lives. But it also meant trust. She folded the paper, tucked it into her locker, and allowed herself a quiet, private smile. But the next morning, it was gone. Her name. Replaced by a male cadet who'd failed 2 field simulations. She stormed into the office, heart pounding. "Sir, there's been a mistake, my deployment slot." Rickman was at the desk, not looking up. He didn't smile. "There's no mistake, Lieutenant," he said. "But I passed all my quals. I ranked." "You're not being sent overseas," he said flatly. "That's final." She stared at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" Rickman finally looked up. His expression wasn't cruel, just cold. Detached. Like they'd never had those late-night feedback sessions. Like he hadn't once called her a natural. "You're a good medic," he said. "But good doesn't mean ready. Not for out there." Eleanor stepped back, stunned. This wasn't about readiness. "No," he said quietly. "It was about optics. And tradition." That night, Eleanor sat on the edge of her bunk, fists clenched around the crumpled deployment sheet. Outside, the wind howled across the empty parade ground. And inside her chest, something else held louder: betrayal. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. The sheet with her name scratched off the deployment list sat like a wound on her desk. Red inked. Final. Outside, the barracks were still, just the low hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional click of boots in the hall. But inside her, something had snapped free. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the silence that followed it. The way no one asked why she wasn't on the list anymore. The way people avoided her eyes in the mess hall, like injustice was just another uniform to ignore. She could feel herself shrinking, and that scared her more than anything. By week's end, she started documenting everything. Training scores. Evaluations. Simulations. She created a private file, typed late at night on a borrowed typewriter in the back office of the clinic. She didn't file a formal complaint. Not yet. That would have been suicide, politically speaking. But she did start asking questions. Quiet ones. To instructors who knew her work. To medics who'd served with women in field hospitals overseas. To one nurse who handed her an internal memo about deployment eligibility standards. It wasn't much. But it was enough to know she wasn't crazy. Or weak. Or too soft. She was being managed. Politely erased. One afternoon, she stayed behind after simulation drills to reorganize supplies. A junior officer, someone she barely knew, lingered in the doorframe. "You didn't hear it from me," he said quietly, "but Rickman's worried about political blowback. He thinks if a female medic gets hurt, or fails, it'll set the Corps back a decade." Eleanor stared at him. "So I'm a liability, because I might succeed?" The officer shrugged. "You scare people. You make it harder to pretend women don't belong out there." And then he left. Back in the present, Ava looked up from her notebook. "So what did you do? File a report?" Eleanor gave a tight smile. "No. I did something harder." "What's that?" "I kept going." A week later, the phone rang in the barracks office. It was her mother. Her voice was tight, panicked. "Eleanor, he's back in the hospital." "Luke." Her brother. The boy she'd made the promise for. The one who'd gotten better, until now. He passed out in school. Fever again. They think it's his kidneys. I don't know. I don't know what to do." The next morning, Eleanor walked into the commanding officer's office. "I need emergency leave," she said. "Family medical." The CO glanced at her file. "You're not deployed. You're not on shift. We can spare you." Relief flooded her face. Then he added, "But if you leave now, you may not be considered for field placement again. You'll miss advanced trauma evals. You'll be off rotation. And the system, well, it remembers who steps away." Eleanor stood frozen in the doorframe. Her heart was with her brother. Her fight was here. She returned to her quarters in silence. Her boots thudded softly against the concrete floor. On her desk, the typewritten file. The red-inked deployment sheet. And her mother's voice echoing in her ears. "We need you. But only if you can come as our Ellie, not as a soldier." And for the first time, Eleanor didn't know who she was without the uniform. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bunk, a folded paper clutched in her lap like it might burn through her palms. The emergency leave form. Signed. Approved. Conditional. If she left now, it wouldn't just be a short pause. She'd lose her standing. Her rotation slot. Her chance to requalify for overseas deployment. Maybe forever. Across from her, the metal locker buzzed slightly from the overhead light. She stared at it, heart knotted. In her locker, a pair of polished boots, a stethoscope, and a crumpled photo of her brother and her in front of a pond. He was 7, smiling with a missing tooth. She was 13, already holding his wrist like she was checking a pulse. She flew home that night. The bus ride from the airport to her hometown was long, humid, and quiet. When she stepped through the hospital doors, the scent of antiseptic hit her like memory. Her mother was curled in a vinyl waiting room chair, gray sweater wrapped tight across her chest. She stood when she saw Eleanor, half sobbing, half smiling. "He's stable now." But it was close. Eleanor nodded and walked into the room alone. Luke looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically, he was almost as tall as her now, but vulnerable. Like time had folded him back into the sick little boy she once vowed to protect. He opened his eyes when she pulled the chair close. "Hey," he rasped. "You came." Eleanor tried to smile. "Of course I did. You're supposed to be, in training or something. Shooting dummies or sewing up people's arms." "You're not a dummy," she said gently, brushing his hair back. "But you've always had a way of pulling me out of formation." They sat like that for a while. Quiet. Breathing together. Back at the base, the days passed without her. No one called. No one asked for an update. She could almost feel herself slipping from the institution's memory, a ghost in olive green. Her mother pleaded with her to stay longer. Luke begged her to sit through just one more scan. And a small part of her wanted to. But another part, the one that remembered every step it took to get into that barracks, every insult she'd swallowed, every test she'd aced, that part refused to let her dream die quietly. 3 days later, Eleanor returned. Not because her family no longer needed her. But because, somehow, the world needed her too. She reported back to base at 0430, wearing the same uniform she'd left in, pressed, sharp, unapologetically female. Her commanding officer raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think we'd see you back." "I didn't come this far," she said, "to watch someone else take my place." He said nothing. Just nodded once, and stamped her re-entry paperwork. Later, in the dormitory, Eleanor opened her locker. Her boots were still there. So was the crumpled photo. This time, she pinned it to the inside door, right next to her field manual. Because whatever came next, she would carry both parts of herself into battle, the soldier and the sister. She laced up her boots slowly, methodically, as if sealing her resolve with every knot. The loudspeaker crackled overhead. "Orders incoming for field training hospital rotation. All personnel report to the yard." Eleanor stood. Her name wasn't on the last list. But this time, she was ready to fight for it. The heat slammed into Eleanor the second she stepped off the C-130. Not heat like Kansas summers, this was different. It clung to her skin like a warning. Grit filled the air, stinging her eyes and sticking to her lips. The ground shimmered, warped with heat waves. And the smell, diesel, dust, and something faintly metallic, was everywhere. She squinted through her goggles as they were ushered off the plane and toward the forward medical tent. It wasn't a hospital. Not really. Just a maze of canvas walls, reinforced stretchers, and exhausted people who didn't flinch at screams. "Welcome to FOB Enthera," someone muttered beside her. Home sweet hell. The next 72 hours blurred. She barely slept. Barely sat. Her first patient arrived within 15 minutes of her boots hitting the dirt, a soldier with half his calf missing and a wife waiting on a video call back home. "Can you save it?" he asked. Eleanor didn't lie. "I can save you," she said. "The leg's another conversation." He nodded, then passed out before the morphine hit. That became the rhythm. Blood. Burn. Breath. Repeat. She learned how to clean sand out of a gunshot wound, how to operate without full imaging, how to triage when there were too many men and not enough hands. But she also learned something else, something deeper. That war medicine wasn't just about stitching people back together. It was about witnessing them fall apart. Then came Julia. Captain Julia Merritt, the combat nurse assigned to Eleanor's trauma tent, was fire in a ponytail. Tough. Fast. Funny in a way that made you forget where you were. "You the doc?" she'd asked on day 2, tugging gloves on with her teeth. Eleanor nodded. "Great. I hate cowards and glory hounds." "Me neither." They clicked instantly. Trusted each other. Saved more than a few lives together before breakfast. Then the mortar hit. It was day 6. Eleanor was mid-suture on a chest wound when the ground convulsed beneath her feet. A sound like the sky breaking in half. Then darkness. The blast missed the tent but hit the vehicle bay 20 yards away. Shouts. Alarms. Smoke. Blood on her face that wasn't hers. She staggered up, heart pounding, and screamed, "Julia?" No answer. She tore through the canvas walls, boots slipping in spilled saline and ash, until she saw her. Captain Merritt, on the ground. Still. Unmoving. Half her face burned. One arm twisted unnaturally. "Julia." Eleanor dropped beside her. She checked the pulse. Faint. Alive. But barely. Back in the present, Ava's pencil froze. "Oh my God, was she?" Eleanor's voice cracked for the first time since she'd started telling the story. "She was my friend. My first real friend in uniform. And in that moment, she was my responsibility." Eleanor carried Julia herself to the trauma bay, bellowing orders as she went. "Vaseline gauze, lidocaine, I need fluids, now." She worked like a machine. But her hands shook. Her voice cracked once. She didn't care. She had trained for trauma. She had not trained for this kind of fear. Julia survived. But she would never serve again. The burns were too deep. Nerve damage too severe. Later that night, as Eleanor sat by her friend's cot, she heard the words that would haunt her for years. "I fought to get you out here," Julia whispered, eyes half-lidded. "They tried to block you. I threatened to resign." Eleanor blinked. "What?" Julia gave a broken laugh. "You didn't know?" She didn't. Not until now. Not until Julia's face, barely able to move, added. "They said we'd pay the price if a woman failed out here. I said we'd pay it if you didn't get the chance." Outside, gunfire echoed faintly in the distance. Inside, Eleanor sat frozen, guilt and gratitude crashing in waves. Because she had made it. But at what cost? The next morning began with silence. Not the kind you welcome, but the kind that coils in the gut like a warning. No choppers. No patients screaming. Just the rustle of sand against canvas and the low hiss of IVs. Eleanor hadn't slept. She'd stayed in the trauma tent all night, watching Julia drift in and out of consciousness, calculating her fluid balance, monitoring her pulse. Every beep of the monitor was a battle won. But her own hands? They wouldn't stop trembling. When the officer entered, clipboard in hand and face stone flat, she thought maybe it was an update on the other wounded. Instead, he said her name. "Lieutenant Hayes. You're to report to the commanding medical officer's tent immediately. Bring your charts from yesterday's log." She blinked. Why? His silence said everything. Inside the admin tent, the air was sharp with formal cold. Colonel Brenner sat behind the desk. 2 MPs stood quietly in the corner. A legal officer in uniform stood to his left, lips tight. Eleanor's heart pounded. She stood at attention. "Lieutenant," Brenner began, "we're opening a preliminary review into your conduct during yesterday's mortar strike." Her breath caught. "My conduct?" "The casualty count, your surgical triage decisions, and a delay in stabilizing Captain Merritt. She was hit 20 feet from the bay." Eleanor snapped. "I got her stabilized faster than." "This is not a debate," the legal officer interrupted. "It's a protocol review." Brenner leaned forward, not unkind, but unmoved. "There's concern your presence compromised the field's operational integrity. That your addition to the trauma tent, under discretionary override, may have led to miscommunication, or worse." It hit her like a punch to the chest. Julia had fought to get her there. And now, because she was there, someone was trying to pin the aftermath on her. Back in the present, Ava sat forward on the floor, stunned. "They blamed you? After everything?" Eleanor's jaw tensed. "They didn't care what I'd done right. Only that I didn't belong. And now they had a crack to wedge open." Eleanor spent the next 3 days preparing. No fieldwork. No patients. Just interviews. Logs. Testimonies. Question after question. "Did you follow triage order? Did you alter the rotation chart? Did you prioritize Captain Merritt due to a personal connection?" They made her explain why Julia was treated before a soldier with a head wound whose vitals were flatlining. Because Julia had a chance, she snapped once. And he didn't. "You want to question my logic? Fine. But don't question my instinct." It didn't matter. The investigation moved forward. One night, she returned to her cot to find her locker open. Inside, her journal was missing. And pinned in its place, an anonymous typed note. "Next time, think twice before stealing someone else's slot." She sat on the edge of her bunk, fists clenched, pulse roaring in her ears. The war she had trained for was outside the gates. But this? This was inside her own camp. Inside her own team. And it was worse. Because it was quiet. Because it had no name. The next morning, the legal officer returned. "You'll testify at the internal hearing in 48 hours, he said. She didn't flinch. But as he turned to leave, he added, almost casually, "There's a new witness. Someone with personal insight into your field behavior." He left. And Eleanor stood there in silence, a terrible thought blooming behind her eyes. They were building a case. And someone she knew was helping them. Eleanor sat on her cot long after lights out, tribunal packet open across her knees like a map of landmines. Charges weren't official yet, but everyone knew what this was. A containment move. A warning shot. The room around her was quiet except for the hum of distant generators and the distant rattle of metal against canvas. Her boots were still laced. Her mind wouldn't stop pacing. She reached into the inside pocket of her duffel bag and pulled out the only thing she trusted more than her own instincts. A thick stack of letters. Military-issue envelopes. Addressed in blocky handwriting. Captain Tom Blake. U.S. Army Logistics Command, Fort Riley, Kansas. They had met during officer candidate school, opposite ends of the same system. Tom was calm, systems-driven, quiet. The kind of man who understood how to move tanks and food and ammo across deserts without ever firing a single shot. He understood how the machine worked. But more than that, he understood her. He knew what it meant to live inside the uniform and still feel invisible. She opened the most recent letter, dated a week before the mortar strike. "Ellie. You were never meant to blend in. Don't forget that. Institutions like this, they're built slow, scared, and male. But you're the lightning bolt that reminds them change doesn't ask permission. Do your job. And when they doubt you, do it better. Always in your corner. Tom. Her hands trembled, but her spine stayed straight. This wasn't the kind of war they trained for in the field. This was paper bullets. Whispers. Character assassinations. And she knew, Tom knew too, how hard it was to win this kind of war alone. The next day, she entered the tribunal prep room. Gray walls. No windows. A pile of dossiers and highlighted reports that reduced patients to incident numbers and surgeries to statistics. At the bottom of the stack, the witness list. Her fingers hovered, then flipped the page. Charge nurse. Field tech. And then her eyes stopped moving. Witness number 3, Major Richard Rickman. Back in the present, Ava's voice broke through. Wait, him? The one who pulled your name from deployment? Eleanor didn't blink. He'd transferred bases. I hadn't seen him in months. But why would he come back? Eleanor's voice darkened. Because I was never supposed to make it here. And now that I had, he couldn't stand it. She returned to her cot and stared at the envelope in her lap. She didn't open it. Just tucked it inside the front breast pocket of her uniform. Close to the skin. Close to the part of her that still believed in duty. Honor. Integrity. Even if the system no longer deserved those words. The next morning, the tribunal tent was filled with dry tension and metal chairs that squeaked too loudly. She stepped through the flap. Rickman was already seated. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. But in his hand, under the edge of his dossier, Eleanor saw something that stopped her cold. A folded letter. Her letter. Not one she had sent. One she had written during training, never mailed. A draft. A confession of doubt. One she thought was buried long ago. And now he was holding it like evidence. As if the truth of her ability could be undone by the truth of her fear. The tribunal room was ice cold, despite the sweltering desert outside. Eleanor sat rigid in her chair, her hands folded on her lap, her heart pacing like it had miles to cover before the truth could catch up. Major Rickman's testimony had been sharp, calculated, laced with carefully chosen words meant to sow just enough doubt, nothing overtly malicious, just enough to plant seeds. She was passionate, yes, he'd said, voice calm. But sometimes passion clouds process. Protocol was stretched. She put herself at risk, and others. And then he'd paused, eyes lingering on the panel. Field medicine isn't just about talent. It's about control. And Lieutenant Hayes didn't always know where her limits were. But the panel didn't close the session. Instead, they asked to hear from her patients. Private Morales, missing 2 toes from a roadside blast, took the stand next. She found me under a flipped Humvee, he said. She climbed into a burning vehicle and held pressure on my leg with her bare hands. I wouldn't be here if she followed protocol. I'd be ashes. Then Sergeant Black, who'd suffered internal bleeding, Eleanor spotted without scans. Then a nurse from her trauma tent. Then a medic who once doubted her, who now said, she made us better. All of us. By the time they were done, even Rickman looked small behind his perfect posture. The tribunal dismissed the charges quietly. No announcement. No apologies. Just a folder mark. Review concluded, no further action. But Eleanor didn't need a speech. She stood, saluted, and left with her spine straight and her eyes dry. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it just endures. Outside, the heat rushed up to greet her. A small knot of soldiers waited by the tent flap, those who had testified. They didn't speak. They just nodded, one by one. She nodded back. Later that evening, Tom found her by the mess tent, sitting on a folding chair with her boots untied and her jacket draped over her knees. He didn't say anything at first. just sat beside her, thigh to thigh, like they'd been doing this forever. "You're still standing," he said finally. "I always was," she replied. He smiled. "I know. But it's different now. You're not standing alone." She looked at him then, really looked. Sunburnt nose. Dust in his lashes. Eyes like quiet storms. And suddenly, everything felt simple. Not easy. But simple. Tom leaned in, voice low. "Then let's stop waiting," he said, brushing her hand. "Let's begin." The chapel on base wasn't really a chapel, just an old supply tent with folding chairs, sandbags stacked outside like someone was afraid love might draw fire. But Eleanor didn't need stained glass. She didn't need trumpets. She just needed one moment. One vow. One man who saw her not as a soldier or a symbol, but as herself. They married at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday. Tom wore his dress uniform. Eleanor wore a pressed set of fatigues and a thin silver chain around her neck, her only jewelry. A chaplain read the vows with soft, steady conviction. Julia, recovering but still on restricted duty, wheeled herself in to be witness. The bouquet was made of local wildflowers, gathered by a nurse with steady hands and a half-smile. Eleanor didn't cry. But when Tom whispered, "No more waiting," as he kissed her palm, she nearly forgot the war existed. They spent one night together, curtains drawn, boots by the door, laughter muffled behind ration tins and desert wind. Then the orders came. Not for Tom. For her. The reassignment came with little fanfare, just a thin envelope and a postmarked seal. Field Hospital Bravo, Eastern Sector. Smaller. Less equipped. High casualty zone. Exactly the kind of place she thrived in. When she arrived, the triage system was chaos, patients lined up without order, paperwork jammed, no prioritization beyond who's bleeding loudest. Eleanor didn't yell. She redesigned the intake structure in a day and trained the staff over 3 nights. She created a color-coded field tagging system for incoming patients, red for critical, yellow for delayed, black for deceased. It wasn't flashy. It just worked. And 3 weeks later, when a convoy was hit and 26 soldiers were airlifted in within 40 minutes, they didn't lose a single one. That night, as the adrenaline wore off and she washed her hands until the blood was gone, her commanding officer stopped by the surgical station. "Whatever you did out there," he said, "do it again." She nodded. But she already had a plan for how to make it better. Because Eleanor wasn't just reacting anymore. She was leading. Back in the present, Ava was writing furiously. "Wait, so you invented a field triage system?" Eleanor shrugged. "Modified it. Standardized it. Applied it under fire. That's not in any of the articles online." Eleanor smirked. "Most of the people who write those weren't the ones doing CPR in sandstorms." She sipped her tea, eyes distant. After that, everything started moving faster. People stopped doubting. Or maybe they just got tired of losing arguments. "I got respect. I got responsibility." She paused. "And then I got the letter." Eleanor reached into the old box on the table and pulled out a sealed manila envelope, its corner stained with age. She handed it to Ava. On the front, "Operation Forward Hand, Medical Command Appointment." "Deployment," she said softly. "But not just any posting." She looked Ava in the eye. This one came with its own field command, and the weight of every life behind it. Command didn't feel like a promotion. It felt like a weight pressed between her shoulder blades. Eleanor's new assignment placed her in charge of an understaffed, overrun field medical unit on a remote base. She was now responsible for triage flow, surgical oversight, and every decision made under the bloodstained tarps they called ORs. But this time, she wasn't deploying alone. She had a child. Two, actually. Tom had moved into on-base family housing with their newborn and a wide-eyed toddler who thought stethoscopes were magic wands. Every morning began with two different uniforms, one for war, one for daycare. Every night ended with her washing blood off her hands before rocking her baby to sleep. She kept separate boots by the front door, sand-caked for surgery, clean-soled for home. But there were no walls strong enough to keep those two worlds from bleeding into each other. Eleanor developed a protocol born of necessity. There weren't enough supplies. Not enough people. So she designed a step-by-step trauma stabilization model specifically for low-resource, high-pressure field environments. It was structured, repeatable, efficient. It didn't require perfect equipment, just steady hands and clear priorities. She trained her staff, wrote it up between shifts, edited it while breastfeeding under dim lights. By the time it reached the military's internal medical review board, it had already been used to save nearly 24 lives. One morning, she opened her inbox to find a message stamp. Publication approved, Military Medical Journal. She read it twice before the baby cried from the other room. She was the first woman officer to publish a surgical field protocol. But there was no toast. No ceremony. Just diaper wipes and deployment rosters. Back in the present, Ava sat back, stunned. You were running a surgical unit, publishing medical research, and raising kids? Eleanor smirked. You learn how to switch brains fast. But the truth? Something was always slipping. You just hoped it wasn't something that would bleed. The bleeding started quietly. Tom began sleeping more, eating less. Then he passed out during a family picnic, right there in the grass, juice box still in his hand. They ran tests. The results came in 2 days later. He didn't tell her immediately. He waited until the kids were asleep and her boots were finally off. She remembered his voice like it was happening all over again. Ellie, they found something. She sat in silence as he explained. Lymphatic. Advanced, but manageable. For now. You're the doctor, he said softly. You know what this means. She nodded. But in that moment, she didn't feel like a doctor. She felt like a mother. A wife. A woman trying to hold everything steady while the foundation cracked beneath her. That night, Eleanor stood in the hallway between the nursery and the kitchen, a baby monitor in one hand and a diagnostic folder in the other. Two futures waited on either side of the door. And no one, not even her, knew which one she'd have to let go of first. There were no alarms this time. No collapse in the grass, no ambulance lights, no rushed diagnoses. Just a slow dimming in Tom's eyes. Less appetite. More silence. A fatigue that settled into his bones like it had signed a lease. The oncologist's words were careful, optimistic, even, but Eleanor heard the subtext. It's progressing faster than we hoped. Her mornings now began with whispered temperature checks and medication schedules, not briefing logs. She left her uniform folded on the bathroom counter some days, too tired to put it on. The fridge was covered in crayon. Drawings layered over deployment schedules and field maps. One in particular caught Eleanor's eye every time she reached for the milk, a stick figure in scrubs, arms outstretched beside a row of what looked like sleeping figures, each tagged with red, yellow, and black scribbles. Mommy at the hospital, Luke Jr. had explained proudly, just 3 years old. She hadn't had the heart to correct him. In his world, hospitals were where heroes went. And Mommy? Mommy came home with dried blood on her boots and a kiss on his forehead. Emily, still barely walking, had her own battlefield, sleep. The baby monitor crackled at all hours, soft wails, whimpers, the occasional mumbled sound that wasn't quite a word yet. On those nights, Eleanor would rise in silence, scoop her daughter from the crib, and rock her back to sleep with one hand while reviewing surgical checklists with the other. She memorized new triage structures to the rhythm of soft lullabies. Her daughter's breath against her shoulder was the metronome to her focus. There were times Eleanor wondered if Emily would remember any of it. The late nights, the quiet comfort, the click of keys under dim nursery light. Maybe not. But Eleanor would. One morning, as she was lacing her boots near the front door, she heard Luke Jr.'s voice from the living room. "Red tag. Priority evac," he shouted, crouched behind the coffee table with 2 plastic soldiers and a toy stethoscope. "Medic incoming. He's got a pulse." Eleanor froze, half kneeling. There was no way he understood what he was mimicking, not really. And yet, the phrases were perfect. The tone. The urgency. He looked up at her with a big smile, oblivious. "I'm you, Mommy," he said proudly. Eleanor smiled back, but her eyes stung. Because he wasn't wrong. But he was too young to carry any of it. The call came on a Wednesday. The Military Medical Board was holding its annual global conference. She was invited to speak. Not just attend. Not just observe. Speak. The first female field officer to present on battlefield surgical leadership. Tom heard the phone ring. Heard the voice on the other end. Saw her expression when she hung up. "Conference?" he asked, already knowing. She nodded. "It's in D.C., she said. 3 days. Go," he replied, instantly. "I can't," she said. I'm still here. But what if something happens?" Tom took her hand, frail but still warm. "Ellie, the only thing worse than dying would be knowing you stopped living for me." Back in the present, Ava set her notebook down. "Did you go?" she asked quietly. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She stared into her tea, as if it could replay those days for her. She went. She wore her dress blues. Recited her notes with flawless cadence. She stood at the podium while generals and scientists nodded and scribbled. She told stories of sand and scalpels. Of protocols invented during blood-soaked chaos. Of teams she led under fire. Of women in uniform who had once been background noise, now commanding tents, tools, and trust. They applauded. They asked for citations. They called her trailblazer. That night, she returned to her hotel room and opened her laptop. Tom's face appeared on the screen, pale, but smiling. "You did it," he said. "I did," she whispered. "But I couldn't breathe until I saw you." He looked at her, soft but steady. "Promise me something." She nodded. "Promise me you'll keep living," he said. "Not just surviving." The call ended. She stared at the black screen, her reflection flickering. Behind her, an unopened folder, her next assignment, a promotion. But all she could hear was his voice. Not just surviving. Tom's decline was gentle, the way snow falls in spring, unexpected but not unwelcome, as if the body had finally decided to surrender softly. He stopped asking for the news. Stopped checking the calendar. Stopped fighting the inevitable. Instead, he asked for books. For music. For her. Eleanor shifted her schedule. Her rank afforded her grace now. Lieutenants and captains beneath her carried out the protocols she'd built. She stayed home more, a stethoscope on one side of her coat rack and Tom's latest blood work on the other. They didn't talk about dying. They talked about remembering. Where they met. What they'd built. The time their toddler flushed her service medal down the toilet. Some nights, they laughed so hard, it hurt. Some nights, it just hurt. He died in the early hours of a Thursday, with her hand over his chest and his over hers. His last breath was steady. certain. Not unlike how he'd lived. The chaplain came. The flags were folded. And Eleanor, still in her t-shirt, still smelling of coffee and salt and soap, sat at the edge of the hospice bed and whispered, "Thank you for letting me carry the war with you." The funeral was quiet. Number 21 gun salute. No parade. Just family. Friends. 2 nurses from base. One former student of his who had once failed U.S. history and showed up anyway in a too large suit. They buried him with the copy of her medical journal article he'd laminated and kept in his drawer. She gave him no eulogy. She couldn't have spoken through it anyway. 2 weeks later, a knock came at the door. A man in dress blues stood outside with a folder pressed tightly in his hand. "Colonel Hayes," he said. "It's my honor to inform you." Her ears stopped registering the rest. She took the folder. Nodded. Closed the door. Inside. Distinguished Service Medal. Awarded for cumulative contributions to battlefield surgical innovation, leadership of multi-gender field teams, and strategic protocol reform under fire. The highest honor short of combat valor. She stood in the hallway and stared at the seal for what felt like hours. Then she placed the folder on the shelf beside Tom's watch. And left it there. Back in the present, Ava had stopped writing. She was staring, jaw trembling, eyes glassy. "You didn't tell anyone?" Eleanor shook her head. "They gave me a podium," she said. "But it felt wrong. He was the one who carried the quiet part of this with me." "You deserved that medal," Ava whispered. "I know," Eleanor replied. "But I didn't need the world to clap for it. I needed him to see me hold it." Later that night, Eleanor stood alone in her kitchen. The Distinguished Service Medal sat on the counter. She reached for it, then stopped. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she'd earned something, or if she'd simply outlived the people who believed she had. The days didn't echo as much as she expected. After the funeral, after the ceremony that wasn't one, after the folded flag and the unopened folder sat untouched on her bookshelf, the house didn't mourn. It waited. It waited for Eleanor to choose what came next. And eventually, she did. Not with fireworks. Not with speeches. But with her hands. She returned to the base part-time. Not as a field surgeon. Not as an officer. As a mentor. She taught trauma prep to incoming medics. Sat in on case reviews. Pulled a handful of female recruits aside each week and walked them through what wasn't in the training manual. How to be brave without being loud. How to lead without apology. How to carry doubt without letting it break you. They started calling her Doc Hayes. Even the new officers. Even the ones who didn't know her story. She didn't correct them. She didn't need titles anymore. At home, the silence became a rhythm. She kept Tom's boots by the door, his favorite mug on the shelf. She didn't talk to him aloud, not often, but sometimes, when the rain tapped the windows just right, she imagined him answering. The house no longer echoed. It pulsed, slow and steady, like a heart recovering after trauma. Like a woman learning how to live again without the constant thud of boots beside her bed. Eleanor didn't fill the space with noise. She let it breathe. Luke Jr. had started middle school. He still wore the old dog tags Tom gave him on his 6th birthday, not around his neck, but looped onto his backpack zipper like a secret he could hold on to when the world got too loud. He had his father's calm. And his mother's posture. Emily was 10 and already full of steel and questions. She followed Eleanor into the clinic sometimes after school, asking about everything, sterilization trays, blood types, field kits. "Why don't they teach us this in science class?" she asked once, slipping on gloves 2 sizes too big. Eleanor smirked. Because most science teachers haven't held someone's heart in their hands. Emily had blinked, then nodded, like that made perfect sense. Eleanor's return to the clinic wasn't dramatic. No grand title. No formal announcement. Just presence. She sat in on triage drills, reviewed new protocols, and gently corrected young medics with a tone that carried both authority and kindness. She told them what couldn't be taught in manuals. That there's a difference between stitching a wound and restoring dignity. That patients didn't just need saving, they needed seeing. That leadership wasn't about control. It was about carrying weight without showing the strain. And sometimes, when she saw a woman hesitate to speak, Eleanor would wait. And wait. Until the silence stretched just long enough for the voice to rise. They pinned a medal on my uniform. But what mattered most was the girl sitting across from me, hearing why it all happened. The Distinguished Service Medal stayed in its box, tucked in a drawer beside Tom's last pair of glasses, and a folded letter Emily had once written in crayon. My mom saves people who save people. Eleanor never touched it. Never pinned it. Not because she didn't care, but because it belonged to someone the world could understand, not the woman who lived the story. At a guest lecture in a local medical college, a young woman waited until the room cleared. Nervous voice. Steady hands. My professor says you rewrote battlefield stabilization protocol, she said. That you taught field hospitals how to work like machines with no parts. Eleanor nodded. I did. But why don't you talk about it? Eleanor paused, then smiled. Because the people who needed me to do it, already know I did. Later that week, Eleanor stood at the kitchen table folding laundry when Emily wandered in with a sketchpad. She held up a pencil drawing, detailed, intentional. A woman in fatigue stood beside a child in a lab coat. On a shelf in the corner, a small, unopened box. What's this? Eleanor asked. Emily shrugged. You. Eleanor's brow softened. And that? Emily tapped the child. That's me. Just, not yet. For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then, gently, she brushed a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. The next morning, Ava, now 14, walked in with her school laptop and a stack of handwritten notes. Eleanor and Emily were sipping tea, their mugs nearly identical, one chipped with age, the other new. Ava set her materials on the table. I want to write it all down, Grandma. Your whole story. Emily didn't flinch. She reached into the drawer, pulled out the velvet box, and placed it between them. Start with this, she said. But don't end there. Eleanor looked at both girls, daughter and granddaughter, and felt the shift. The story was no longer hers alone. That night, Eleanor opened the box for the first time in years. The metal inside was heavier than she remembered, not for the metal, but for what it carried. The lives. The decisions. The night she held Tom's hand while reading casualty reports. The morning she showed up anyway. She didn't pin it on. She didn't need to. The rain tapped gently against the windows the next morning as Ava worked quietly beside her. Eleanor watched her flip through maps, reports, notes, and paused when Ava asked, Grandma, why didn't you ever wear it? Eleanor took a long breath. They gave it to the version of me that made sense to them, Colonel Eleanor Hayes. Field Commander. Officer. Innovator. She tapped the pages. But the battles that mattered most weren't always seen. They happened off record. After hours. In silence. In sacrifice. That medal didn't come from one act of courage. It came from every time I chose to stay, to speak up, to heal someone who couldn't ask. She looked into Ava's eyes. It's not that I didn't want it. I just never needed it to prove who I was. Ava reached for the box and slowly opened it. The golden cross on its crimson ribbon gleamed, untouched by time. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Eleanor nodded. "But the beauty isn't in the metal. It's in the story that made it necessary." She leaned back in her chair, brushing the edges of an old photo, Tom holding Luke Jr. in one arm, her commendation letter in the other. "I didn't wear it," she said softly, "because the only people I ever needed to see me, already did." Ava closed the box gently, her voice firmer now. "Then I'll tell the story." Eleanor tilted her head. "All of it," Ava added. "Not just the titles and awards. The parts that mattered. The parts you lived." Eleanor's throat tightened, but this time, it wasn't grief. It was something else. Relief. She reached for Ava's hand and squeezed gently. "Start with this story," she said. "Tell it right."